Preparatory to anything else, Mr. Bloom brushed off the greater bulk in the shavings and handed Stephen the hat and a splange and bucked him up generally in orthodox Samaritan fashion, which he very badly needed. Stephen's mind was not exactly what you would call wandering, but a bit unsteady, and on his expressed desire for some beverage to drink Mr. Bloom, in view of the hour it was and there being no pump of artery water available for their ablutions, let alone drinking purposes, hit upon an expedient by suggesting, off the reel, the propriety of the cabman's shelter, as it was called, hardly a stone's throw away near Butt Bridge, where they might hit upon some drinkables in the shape of a milk and soda or mineral. But how to get there was the rub. For the nonce he was rather nonplussed, but inasmuch as the duty plainly devolved upon him to take some measures on the subject, he pondered suitable ways and means, during which Stephen repeatedly yawned. So far as he could see, he was rather pale in the face, so that it occurred to him as highly advisable to get a conveyance of some description which would answer in the condition, both of them being E.D., particularly Stephen, always assuming that there was such a thing to be found. Accordingly, after a few such preliminaries as brushing, in spite of his having forgotten to take up his rather soap-suddy handkerchief after it had done yeoman service in the shaving line, they both walked together along Beaver Street, or, more properly, Lane, as far as the farriers and the distantly affected atmosphere of the livery stables at the corner of Montgomery Street, where they made tracks to the left, from thence debouching into Amiens Street round by the corner of Dan Bergen's. But as he confidently anticipated, there was not a sign of Jay plying for hire anywhere to be seen except a four-wheeler, probably engaged by some fellows inside on the spree, outside the North Star Hotel, and there was no symptom of its budging a quarter of an inch when Mr. Bloom, who was anything but a professional whistler, endeavored to hail it by emitting a kind of a whistle, holding his arms arched over his head, twice. This was a quandary, but, bringing common sense to bear on it, evidently there was nothing for it but put a good face on the matter and foot it, which they accordingly did. So, beveling around by moonlight on the signal house, which they shortly reached, they proceeded perforce in the direction of Amiens Street railway terminus, Mr. Bloom being handicapped by the circumstance that one of the back buttons of his trousers had, to vary the Timuhonoran adage, gone the way of all buttons, though, entering thoroughly into the spirit of the thing, he heroically made light of them as chance. So as neither of them were particularly pressed for time, as it happened, and the temperature refreshing since it cleared up after the recent visitation of Jupiter Pluvius, they dandered along past by where the empty vehicle was waiting without a fare or a jarvey. As it so happened, a Dublin United Tramways Company's Sandsruer happened to be returning, and the elder man recounted to his companion a grave propos of the incident, his own truly miraculous escape of some little while back. They passed the main entrance of the Great Northern Railway Station, the starting point for Belfast, where of course all traffic was suspended at that late hour, and passing the back door of the morgue, a not very enticing locality, not to say gruesome to a degree, more especially at night, ultimately gained the Dock Tavern, and in due course turned into Store Street, famous for its C Division police station. Between this point and the high at present and warehouses of Beersford Place, Stephen thought to think of Ibsen, associated with Baird's The Stonecutters, in his mind somehow in Talbot Place, first turning on the right, while the other, who was acting as his Phyllis Atkinson, held with internal satisfaction the smell of James Roderick's City Bakery, situated quite close to where they were, the very palatable odor indeed of our daily bread, of all commodities of the public the primary and most indispensable. Bread, the staff of life, earn your bread, oh tell me where's fancy bread, at Roderick's the baker's, it is said. En route to his taciturn and, not to put too fine a point on it, not yet perfectly sober companion, Mr. Bloom, who at all events was in complete possession of his faculties, never more so, in fact disgustingly sober, spoke a word of caution re the dangers of night and women of ill fame and swellmaps men, which, barely permissible once in a while though not as a habitual practice, was of the nature of a regular death trap for young fellows of his age, particularly if they had acquired drinking habits under the influence of liquor, unless you knew a little jiu-jitsu for every contingency, as even a fellow on the broad of his back could administer an nasty kick at the who didn't look out. Highly providential was the appearance on the scene of Corny Kelleher when Stephen was blissfully unconscious, but for the man in the Gap turning up at the 11th hour, the Fenies might have been a candidate for the accident ward, or, failing that, the Brimwell in an appearance in the court next day before Mr. Tobias, or, he being the solicitor rather, Old Wool, he meant to say, or mahogany, which simply spelt ruin for a chap when it got brewed about. The reason he mentioned the fact was that a lot of those policemen, whom he cordially disliked, were admittedly unscrupulous in the service of the Crown and, as Mr. Bloom put it, recalling a case or two in the division in Clonbrassil Street, prepared to swear a hole through a 10-gallon pot. Never on the spot when wanted, but in quiet parts of the city, Pembroke Road for example, the guardians of the law were well in evidence, the obvious reason being they were paid to protect the upper classes. Another thing he commented on was equipping soldiers with firearms or sidearms of any description liable to go off at any time, which was tantamount to inciting them against civilians should by any chance they fall out over anything. You frittered away your time, he very sensibly maintained, in health and also character, besides which, the squander mania of the thing, fast women of the demon ran away with a lot of illness. Into the bargain, and the greatest danger of all was who you got drunk with, though, touching the much vexed question of stimulants, he relished a glass of choice old wine in season as both nourishing and blood-making and possessing aperient virtues, notably a good Burgundy, which he was a staunch believer in, still never beyond a certain point where he invariably drew the line as it simply led to trouble all around, to say nothing of your being at the tender mercy of others practically. Most of all he commented adversely on the desertion of Stephen by all his pub-hunting confreres but one, a most glaring piece of ratting on the part of his brother medicos under all the circs. And that one was Joyce, Stephen said, who up to then had said nothing whatsoever of any kind. Discussing these and kindred topics, they made a beeline across the back of the custom house and passed under the loop-lined bridge, where a brazier of coke burning in front of a sentry box or something like one attracted their rather lagging footsteps. Stephen of his own accord stopped for no special reason to look at the heap of barren cobblestones, and by the light emanating from the brazier he could just make out the darker figure of the corporation watchman inside the gloom of the sentry box. He began to remember that this had happened or had been mentioned as having happened before, but it cost him no small effort before he remembered that he recognized in the sentry a quondam friend of his father's, Gunley. To avoid a meeting he drew near to the pillars of the railway bridge. "Someone saluted you," Mr. Bloom said. A figure of middle height on the prowl, evidently under the arches, saluted again, calling, "Night." Stephen of course started rather dizzily and stopped to return the compliment. Mr. Bloom, actuated by motives of inherent delicacy, inasmuch as he always believed in minding his own business, moved off, but nevertheless remained on the qui-vive with just a shade of anxiety, though not funkish in the least. Though unusual in the Dublin area, he knew that it was not by any means unknown for desperadoes who had next to nothing to live on to be abroad waylaying and generally terrorizing peaceable pedestrians by placing a pistol at their head in some secluded spot outside the city proper. Famous loiterers of the Thames Embankment category, they might be hanging about there, or simply marauders ready to decamp with whatever boodle they can in one fell swoop at a moment's notice, your money or your life, leaving you there to point a moral, gagged and garroted. Stephen, that is when the accosting figure came to close quarters, though he was not in an over-sober state himself, recognized Corley's breath redolent of rotten cornges. Lord John Corley, some called him, and his genealogy came about in this wise. He was the eldest son of Inspector Corley of the G Division, lately deceased, who had married a certain Catherine Brophy, the daughter of the Louth farmer. His grandfather Patrick Michael Corley of New Ross had married the widow of a publican there whose maiden name had been Catherine, also Talbot. Rumor had it, though not proved, that she descended from the house of the Lords Talbot Malahide, in whose mansion, really an unquestionably fine residence of its kind and well worth seeing, her mother and or some relative, a woman, as the tale went, of extreme beauty, had enjoyed the distinction of being in service in the Vache kitchen. This therefore was the reason why the still comparatively young though dissolute man who now addressed Stephen was spoken of by some with facetious proclivities as Lord John Corley. Taking Stephen on one side, he had the customary doleful ditty to tell. Not as much as a farthing to purchase a night's lodgings. His friends had all deserted him. Furthermore, he had a row with Lenihan and called him to Stephen a mean bloody swab, with a sprinkling of a number of other unglamorous expressions. He was out of a job and implored Stephen to tell him where on God's earth he could get something, anything at all, to do. No, it was the daughter of the mother in the Vache kitchen that was foster sister to the heir of the house, or else they were connected through the mother in some way, both occurrences happening at the same time if the whole thing wasn't a complete fabrication from start to finish. Anyhow, he was all in. "I wouldn't ask you only," pursued he, "on my solemn oath, and God knows I'm on the rocks. There'll be a job tomorrow or next day," Stephen told him, "in a boys' school at Dacke for a gentleman usher. Mr. Garrett Thesey. Try it. You may mention my name." "Ah, God," Corley replied, "sure I couldn't teach in a school, man. I was never one of your bright ones," he added with a half-laugh. "I got stuck twice in the junior of the Christian Brothers. I have no place to sleep myself," Stephen informed him. Corley at the first go-off was inclined to suspect it was something to do with Stephen being fired out of his digs for bringing in a bloody tart off the street. There was a Doss house in Marlborough Street, Mrs. Maloney's, but it was only a tenner touch and full of undesirables. But M. Kanaki told him you got a decent enough do in the Brazen Head over in Winna Tavern Street, which was distantly suggestive that the person addressed the Friar Bacon for a bob. He was starving too, though he hadn't said a word about it. Though this sort of thing went on every other night or very near it, still Stephen's feelings got the better of him in a sense, though he knew that Corley's brand of rigmarole on a par with the others was hardly deserving of much credence. However, how ignorance malorum miseris scurere disco, etc., as a Latin poet remarks, especially as luck would have it, he got paid his screw after every middle of the month on the 16th, which was the day of the month as a matter of fact, though a good bit of the wherewithal was demolished. But the cream of the joke was nothing would get it out of Corley's head that he was living in affluence and hadn't a thing to do but hand out the needful. Whereas, he put his hand in a pocket anyhow, not with the idea of finding any food there, but thinking he might lend him anything up to a bob or so in the loose, so that he might endeavor at all events and get sufficient to eat. But the result was in the negative, for, to his chagrin, he found his cash missing. A few broken biscuits were all the result of his investigation. He tried his hardest to recollect for the moment whether he had lost as well he might have or left, because in that contingency it was not a pleasant lookout, very much the reverse in fact. He was altogether too fagged out to institute a thorough search, though he tried to recollect. About biscuits he dimly remembered. Who now exactly gave them, he wondered, or where was ordered he buy. However, in another pocket he came across what he surmised in the dark were pennies, erroneously however, as it turned out. "Those are half-crowns, man," Corley corrected him. And so in point of fact they turned out to be. Stephen anyhow loaned him one of them. "Thanks," Corley answered, "you were a gentleman. I'll pay you back one time." "Who's that with you?" "I saw him a few times in the Bleeding Horse in Camden Street with Bullet, the bill sticker. You might put in a good word for us to get me taken on there. I'd carry a sandwich board, only the girl in the office told me they're full up for the next 3 weeks, man. God, you to book ahead, man, you'd think it was for the Carl Rosa. I don't give a shite anyway so long as I get a job, even as a crossing sweeper." Subsequently, being not quite so down in the mouth after the 2 and 6 he got, he informed Stephen about a fellow by the name of Baggs Comiskey that he said Stephen knew well out of Fulham's, the ship chandler's bookkeeper there that used to be often round in Nigglesback with Omar and the little chap with a stud of the name of Tug. Anyhow, he was lagged the night before last and found 10 bob for a drunk and disorderly and refusing to go with the constable. 210 Mr. Bloom in the meanwhile kept dodging about in the vicinity of the cobblestones near the brazier of coke in front of the corporation watchman's centre box, who, evidently a glutton for work, it struck him, was having a quiet 40 winks for all intents and purposes on his own private account while Dublin slept. He threw an odd eye at the same time now and then at Stephen's anything but immaculately attired interlocutor, as if he had seen the nobleman somewhere or other, though where he was not in a position to truthfully state, nor had he the remotest idea where. Being a level-headed individual who could give points to not a few in point of shrewd observation, he also remarked on his very dilapidated hat and slouchy wearing apparel, generally testifying to a chronic impecuniosity. Palpably he was one of his Hangerson, but for the matter of that it was merely a question of one preying on his next-door neighbor all around, and every deed, so to put it, a deeper depth, and for the matter of that if the man in the street chanced to be in the dock himself, penal servitude with or without the option of a fine would be a very rare avis altogether. In any case, he had a consummate amount of cool assurance in intercepting people at that hour of the night or morning. Pretty thick it was certainly. The pair parted company and Stephen rejoined Mr. Bloom, who, with his practiced eye, was not without perceiving that he had succumbed to the blind eloquence of the other parasite. Alluding to the encounter, he said, laughingly, "Stephen, that is, he is down on his luck. He asked me to ask you to ask somebody named Boyd, a bill sticker, to give him a job as a sandwichman." At this intelligence, in which he seemingly evinced little interest, Mr. Bloom gazed abstractedly for the space of a half a second or so into the bucket dredger, rejoicing in the far-famed name of Atlanta, moored alongside Custom House Key and quite possibly out of repair, whereupon he observed evasively, "Everybody gets their own ration of luck, they say." Now you mention it, his face was familiar to me. "But, leaving that for the moment, how much did you part with?" he queried, "if I am not too inquisitive." "Half a crown," Stephen responded. "I dare say he needs it to sleep somewhere." "Needs?" Mr. Bloom ejaculated, professing not the least surprise at the intelligence. "I can quite credit the assertion, and I guarantee he invariably does. Everyone according to his needs, or everyone according to his deeds? But, talking about things in general, where," added he with a smile, "will you sleep yourself? Walking to Sandy Cove is out of the question. And even supposing you did, you won't get in after what occurred at Westland Row Station. Simply fag out there for nothing. I don't mean to presume to dictate to you in the slightest degree, but why did you leave your father's house?" "To seek misfortune," was Stephen's answer. "I met your respected father on a recent occasion," Mr. Bloom diplomatically returned, "today in fact, or to be strictly accurate, on yesterday." "Where does he live at present?" I gathered in the course of conversation that he had moved. "I believe he is in Dublin somewhere," Stephen answered unconcernedly. "Why?" "A gifted man," Mr. Bloom said, "that Mr. Delas Sr., and more respects than one in a born raconteur ever there with one. He takes great pride, quite legitimate, out of you. You could go back perhaps," he hazarded, still thinking of the very unpleasant scene at Westland Road terminus when it was perfectly evident that the other two, Mulligan, that is, and that English tourist friend of his, who eventually euchred their third companion, were patently trying as if the whole Batley station belonged to them to give Stephen the slip in the confusion, which they did. There was no response forthcoming to the suggestion, however, such as it was, Stephen's mind's eye being too busily engaged in repicturing his family hearth the last time he saw it, with his sister Dilly sitting by the ingle, her hair hanging down, waiting for some weak Trinidad shell cocoa that was in the suet-coated kettle to be done so that she and he could drink it with the oatmeal water for milk after the fried herrings they had eaten at 2 a penny with an egg apiece for Maggie, Booty and Katy, the cat meanwhile under the mangle devouring a mess of eggshells and charred fish heads and bones on a square of brown paper, in accordance with the third precept of the church to fast and abstain on the days commanded, it being quarter tens or if not, ember days or something like that. "No," Mr. Bloom repeated again, "I wouldn't personally repose much trust in that boon companion of yours who contributes the humorous element, Dr. Mulligan, as a guide, philosopher and friend if I were in your shoes. He knows which side his bread is buttered on, though in all probability he never realized what it is to be without regular meals. Of course you didn't notice as much as I did. But it wouldn't occasion me the least surprise to learn that a pinch of tobacco or some narcotic was put near a drink for some ulterior object." He understood, however, from all he heard, that Dr. Mulligan was a versatile all-round man, by no means confined to medicine only, who was rapidly coming to the fore in his line and, if the report was verified, bade fair to enjoy flourishing practice in the not-too-distant future as a Tony medical practitioner, drawing a handsome fee for his services, in addition to which professional status his rescue of that man from certain drowning by artificial respiration and what they call first aid at scaries, formaldehyde he was bound to admit, an exceedingly plucky deed which he could not too highly praise, so that frankly he was utterly at a loss to fathom what earthly reason could be at the back of it, except he put it down to sheer cussedness or jealousy, pure and simple. "Except it simply amounts to the one thing, and he is what they call picking your brains," he ventured to throw out. the guarded glance of half solicitude, half curiosity augmented by friendliness which he gave at Stephen's at-present morose expression of features did not throw a flood of light, none at all in fact, on the problem as to whether he had let himself be badly bamboozled. To judge by 2 or 3 low-spirited remarks he let drop or the other way about saw through the affair, and for some reason or other best known to himself allowed matters to more or less grinding poverty did have the effect, and he more than conjectured that, high educational abilities though he possessed, he experienced no little difficulty in making both ends meet. Adjacent to the men's public urinal they perceived an ice cream car around which a group of presumably Italians in heated altercation were getting rid of voluble expressions in their vivacious language in a particularly animated way, there being some little differences between the parties. Putana Madonna, J.C. di Quattrini. Ho Ragione. Kilo Rodo. Intendi Amaki. Mezzo Salvano Più. Dice Lui, Pro. Mezzo. Farabuto. Mortacci Sui. Ma Ascolta. Cinque la testa più. Mr. Bloom and Stephen entered the cabman's shelter, an unpretentious wooden structure, where, prior to then, he had rarely if ever been before, the former having previously whispered to the latter a few hints anent the keeper of it said to be the once famous Skinnagoat Fitzharris, the invincible, though he could not vouch for the actual facts which quite possibly there was not one vestige of truth in. A few moments later saw our 2 noctambules safely seated in a discreet corner, only to be greeted by stares from the decidedly miscellaneous collection of wives and strays and other nondescript specimens of the genus Homo already there engaged in eating and drinking, diversified by conversation for whom they seemingly formed an object of marked curiosity. Now touching a cup of coffee, Mr. Bloom ventured to plausibly suggest to break the ice, it occurs to me you ought to sample something in the shape of solid food. Say, a roll of some description. Accordingly his first act was with characteristic sang-froid to order these commodities quietly. The hoi polloi of Jarvis or Stevedores or whatever they were after cursory examination turned their eyes apparently dissatisfied, away though one red-bearded bibulous individual portion of his hair was grayish, a sailor probably, still stared for some appreciable time before transferring his rapt attention to the floor. Mr. Bloom, availing himself of the right of free speech, he having just a bowing acquaintance with the language in dispute, though, to be sure, rather in a quandary over Voglio, remarked to his protege in an audible tone of voice apropos of the battle royal in the street which was still raging fast and furious, a beautiful language. I mean for singing purposes. Why do you not write your poetry in that language? Bella poetry. It is so melodious and full. Belladonna. Voglio. Stephen, who was trying his dead best to yawn if he could, suffering from lassitude generally, replied, to fill the ear of a cow-elephant. They were haggling over money. Is that so? Mr. Bloom asked. Of course, he subjoined pensively, at the inward reflection of there being more languages to start with than were absolutely necessary, it may be only the southern glamour that surrounds it. The keeper of the shelter in the middle of this tete-a-tete put a boiling swimming cup of a choice concoction like coffee on the table and a rather antediluvian specimen of a bun, or so it seemed. After which he beat a retreat to his counter, Mr. Bloom determining to have a good square look at him later on so as not to appear to. For which reason he encouraged Stephen to proceed with his eyes while he did the honors by surreptitiously pushing the cup of what was temporarily supposed to be called coffee gradually nearer him. Sounds are impostures, Stephen said after a pause of some little time, like names. Cicero, Podmore. Napoleon, Mr. Goodbody. Jesus, Mr. Doll. Shakespeare's were as common as Murphy's. Wilson a name. Yes, to be sure, Mr. Bloom unaffectedly concurred. Of course. Our name was changed too, he added, pushing the so-called roll across. The red-bearded sailor who had his weather eye on the newcomers bored at Stephen, whom he had singled out for attention in particular, squarely by asking, "And what might your name be?" Just in the nick of time Mr. Bloom touched his companion's boot, but Stephen, apparently disregarding the warm pressure from an unexpected quarter, answered, "Daedalus." The sailor stared at him heavily from a pair of drowsy baggy eyes, rather bunged up from excessive use of booze, preferably good old Hollands and water. "You know Simon Ulysses?" he asked at length. "I've heard of him," Stephen said. Mr. Bloom was all at sea for a moment, seeing the others evidently eavesdropping too. "He's Irish," the seaman bold affirmed, staring still in much the same way and nodding. "All Irish." "All too Irish," Stephen rejoined. As for Mr. Bloom, he could neither make head or tail of the whole business, and he was just asking himself what possible connection when the sailor of his own accord turned to the other occupants of the shelter with the remark, "I seen him shoot 2 eggs off 2 bottles at 50 yards over his shoulder." The left-hand dead shot. Though he was slightly hampered by an occasional stammer and his gestures being also clumsy as it was, still he did his best to explain. "Bottles out there, say. 50 yards measured. Eggs on the bottles." Cocks his gun over his shoulder. Aims. He turned his body half round, shut up his right eye completely. Then he screwed his features up some way sideways and glared out into the night with an unprepossessing cast of countenance. "Pom." He then shouted once. The entire audience waited, anticipating an additional detonation, there being still a further egg. "Pom." He shouted twice. Egg 2 evidently demolished, he nodded and winked, adding bloodthirstily, "Buffalo Bill shoots to kill, never miss nor he never will." A silence ensued till Mr. Bloom, for agreeableness sake, just felt like asking him whether it was for a marksmanship competition like the League. "Beg pardon," the sailor said. "Long ago," Mr. Bloom pursued without flinching a hair's breadth. "Why," the sailor replied, relaxing to a certain extent under the magic influence of diamond-cut diamond, "it might be a matter of 10 years. He toured the wide world with Hengler's Royal Circus. I seen him do that in Stockholm. Curious coincidence," Mr. Bloom confided to Stephen unobtrusively. "Murphy's my name," the sailor continued. "D.B. Murphy of Carrigallo. Know where that is?" "Queenstown Harbor," Stephen replied. "That's right," the sailor said. "Fort Camden and Fort Carlisle. That's where I hails from. I belongs there. That's where I hails from. My little woman's down there. She's waiting for me, I know. For England, home and beauty. She's my own true wife I haven't seen for 7 years now, sailing about." Mr. Bloom could easily picture his advent on this scene, the homecoming to the mariner's roadside shilling after having dated Davy Jones, a rainy night with a blind moon. Across the world for a wife. Quite a number of stories there were on that particular Alice Benbow topic, Enoch Arden and Rip Van Winkle, and does anybody hereabouts remember Cock O'Leary, a favorite and most trying declamation piece by the way of poor John Casey, and a bit of perfect poetry in its own small way. Never about the runaway wife coming back, however much devoted to the absentee. The face at the window. Judge of his astonishment when he finally did breast the tape and the awful truth dawned upon him and his better half, wrecked in his affections. "You little expected me, but I've come to stay and make a fresh start." There she sits, a grass widow, at the self-same fireside. Believes me dead, rocked in the cradle in the deep. And there sits Uncle Chub or Tompkin, as the case might be, the publican of the Crown and Anchor, in shirt sleeves, eating rump steak and onions. No chair for father. Brute. The wind. Her brand new arrival is on her knee, post-mortem child. With a hiro. And a randy row. And my galloping tearing tandy, oh! But of the inevitable. Grin and bear it. I remain with much love your broken-hearted husband D.B. Murphy. The sailor, who scarcely seemed to be a Dublin resident, turned to one of the Jarvies with the request, "You don't happen to have such a thing as a spare chaw about you?" The Jarvie, addressed as it happened, had not, but the keeper took a dive plug from his good jacket hanging on a nail, and the desired object was passed from hand to hand. "Thank you," the sailor said. He deposited the quid in his gob and, chewing and with some slow stammers, Proceeded, we come up this morning 11 o'clock. The three-master rose 7 from Bridgewater with bricks. I shipped to get over. Paid off this afternoon. There's my discharge. C. D. Murphy. ABSN confirmation of which statement he extricated from an inside pocket and handed to his neighbor a not very clean-looking folded document. You must have seen a fair share of the world, the keeper remarked, leaning on the counter. Why, the sailor answered upon reflection upon it, I've circumnavigated a bit since I first joined on. I was in the Red Sea. I was in China and North America and South America. We was chased by pirates one voyage. I seen icebergs plenty, growlers. I was in Stockholm in the Black Sea, the Dardanelles under Captain Dalton, the best bloody man that ever scuttled a ship. I seen Russia. Господи помилуй. That's how the Russians praise. You seen queer sights, don't be talking, put in a jarvey. Why, the sailor said, shifting his partially chewed plug. I seen queer things too, ups and downs. I seen a crocodile bite the fluke at an anchor same as I chew the quid. He took out of his mouth the pulpy quid and, lodging it between his teeth, bit ferociously, con. Like that. And I seen monators in Peru that eats corpses and the livers of horses. Look here. Here they are. A friend of mine sent me. He fumbled out a picture postcard from his inside pocket which seemed to be in its rare species of repository and pushed it along the table. The printed matter on it stated, Chosen Indios. Beni, Bolivia. All focused their attention at the scene exhibited, a group of savage women in striped loincloths, squatted, blinking, suckling, frowning, sleeping amid a swarm of infants. There must have been quite a score of them outside some primitive shanties of osier. Chews coca all day, the communicative tarpaulin added. Stomachs like bread graters. Cuts off their daddies when they can't bear no more children. See them sitting there stark balaknik eating a dead horse's liver raw. His postcard proved a center of attraction for Messrs. The Greenhorns for several minutes and more. Know how to keep them off? He inquired generally. Nobody volunteering a statement. He winked, saying, glass. That boggles him. Glass. Mr. Bloom, without evincing surprise, unostentatiously turned over the card to peruse the partially obliterated address and postmark. It ran as follows, Tarjeta Postal, Senora Budin, Galleria Beck, Santiago, Chile. There was no message evidently, as he took particular notice. Though not an implicit believer in the lurid story narrated, or the egg-sniping transaction for that matter, despite William Tell and the Lazarillo Don Cesar de Bazan incident depicted in Mauritania, on which occasion the former's ball passed through the latter's hat, having detected a discrepancy between his name, assuming he was the person he represented himself to be and not sailing under false colors after having boxed the compass on the strict QT somewhere in the fictitious addressee of the missive, which made him nourish some suspicions of our friend's bona fides. Nevertheless, it reminded him in a way of a long-cherished plan he meant to one day realize some Wednesday or Saturday of traveling to London by long sea. Not to say that he had ever traveled extensively to any great extent, but he was at heart a born adventurer, though by a trick of fate he had consistently remained a landlubber, except he called going to Holyhead, which was his longest. Martin Cunningham frequently said he would work a pass through even, but some deuced hitch or other eternally cropped up, with the net result that the scheme fell through. But even suppose it had come to planking down the needful and breaking Boyd's heart, it was not so dear, purse permitting. A few guineas at the outside, considering the fare to Mullingar where he figured on going was 5 and 6, there and back. The trip would benefit health on account of the bracing ozone and being every way thoroughly pleasurable, especially for a chap whose liver was out of order, seeing the different places along the route, Plymouth, Falmouth, Southampton and so on, culminating in an instructive tour of the sights of the great metropolis, the spectacle of our modern Babylon, where doubtless he would see the greatest improvement, Tower, Abbey, wealth of Park Lane to a new acquaintance with. Another thing just struck him as about a man's bad notion was he might have a gaze around on the spot to see about trying to make arrangements about a concert tour of summer music embracing the most prominent pleasure resorts, Margate with mixed bathing and first-rate hydrosin spas, Eastbourne, Scarborough, Margate and so on, beautiful Bournemouth, the Channel Islands and similar beach spots, which might prove highly remunerative. Not, of course, with a hole and corner scratch company or local ladies on the job. Witness Mrs. CPM Coa type, lend me your valise and I'll post you the ticket. No, something top-notch, an all-star Irish cast, the Tweedy Flower Grand Opera Company with his own legal consort as leading lady as a sort of counterblast to the Ulster grimes and moody manners. Perfectly simple matter, and he was quite sanguine of success, providing puffs in the local papers could be managed by some fellow with a bit of bounce who could pull the indispensable wires and thus combine business with pleasure. But who? That was the rub. Also, without being actually positive, it struck him a great field was to be opened up in the line of opening up new routes to keep pace with the times apropos of the Fishguard Drossler route which, it was mooted, was once more on the tapis in the circumlocution departments with the usual quantity of red tape and dilly-dallying of a fig for Jadon and dunderheads generally. A great opportunity there certainly was for push and enterprise to meet the traveling needs of the public at large. The average man, that is Brown, Robinson and Company, was a subject of regret and absurd as well on the face of it, and no small blame to our Vonian society that the man in the street, when the system really needed toning up for the matter of a couple of paltry pounds, was debarred from seeing more of the world they lived in instead of being always and ever cooped up since my old stick in the mud took me for a wife. After all, hang it, they had their 11 and more humdrum months of it and merited a radical change of venue after the grind of city life in the summer time for choice when Dame Nature is at her spectacular best, constituting nothing short of a new lease of life. There were equally excellent opportunities for vacationists in the home island, delightful sylvan spots for rejuvenation, offering a plethora of attractions as well as a bracing tonic for the system in and around Dublin and its picturesque environs, even Palafolca, to which there was a steam tram, but also farther away from the madding crowd in Wicklow, rightly termed the Garden of Ireland, an ideal neighborhood for elderly women so long as it didn't come down, and in the wilds of Donegal where if report spoke true the coup d'oil was exceedingly grand, though the last-named locality was not easily get-atable, so that the influx of visitors was not as yet all that it might be, considering the signal benefits to be derived from it, while Hove, with its historic associations and otherwise, Silken Thomas, Grace O'Malley, George IV, rhododendrons several hundred feet above sea level, was a favorite haunt with all sorts and conditions of men, especially in the spring when young men's fancy, though it hit its own toll of deaths by falling off the cliffs by design or accidentally, usually, by the way, on their left leg, it being only about 3/4 of an hour's run from the pillar. Because of course up to date tourist traveling was as yet merely in its infancy, so to speak, and the accommodation left much to be desired. Interesting to fathom, it seemed to him from a motive of curiosity, pure and simple, was whether it was the traffic that created the route or vice versa, or the two sides in fact. He turned back the other side of the card, picture, and passed it along to Stephen. "I seen a Chinese one time," related the dowdy narrator, "that had little pills like putty, and he put them in the water and they opened, and every pill was something different. One was a ship, another was a house, another was a flower. Cooks rats in your soup," he appetizingly added, "the chinks does." Possibly perceiving an expression of dubiosity on their faces, the globe-trotter went on, adhering to his adventures. "And I seen a man killed in Trieste by an Italian chap. Knife at his back. Knife like that." While speaking he produced a dangerous-looking clasp knife quite in keeping with his character and held it in the striking position. "In a knocking shop it was count of a trial between two smugglers. Fellow hid behind a door, come up behind him. Like that. 'Prepare to meet your God,' says he. It went into his back up to the butt." His heavy glance drowsily roaming about kind of defied their further questions, even should they by any chance want to. "That's a good bit of steel," repeated he, examining his formidable stiletto. After which harrowing an amount sufficient to appall the status, he snapped the blade to and stowed the weapon in question away as before in his chamber of horrors, otherwise pocket. "They're great for the cold steel," somebody who was evidently quite in the dark said for the benefit of them all. That was why they thought the park murders of the Invincibles was done by foreigners on account of them using knives. At this remark passed obviously in the spirit of where ignorance is bliss. Mr. B and Stephen, each in his own particular way, both instinctively exchanged meaning glances, in a religious silence of the strictly outrageous variety however, towards where Skin the goat, alias the keeper, not turning a hair, was drawing spurts of liquid from his bowl of fare. His inscrutable face, which was really a work of art, a perfect study in itself, begaring description, conveyed the impression that he didn't understand one jot of what was going on. Funny, very. There ensued a somewhat lengthy pause. One man was reading in fits and would start to stand by coffee evening journal, another the card with the native ethnicity, another the seaman's discharge. Mr. Bloom, so far as he was personally concerned, was just pondering in pensive mood. He vividly recollected when the occurrence alluded took place as well as yesterday, roughly some score of years previously in the days of the land troubles, when it took the civilized world by storm, figuratively speaking, early in the 80s, Taiwan to be correct, when he was just turned 15. "Ah, boss," the sailor broke in. "Give us back the papers." The request being complied with, he clawed them up with a scrape. "Have you seen the Rock of Gibraltar?" Mr. Bloom inquired. The sailor grimaced, chewing, in a way that might be read as yes, or no. "Ah, you've touched the two," Mr. Bloom said, Europa Point, thinking he had, in the hope that the rover might possibly buy some reminiscences, but he failed to do so, simply letting Spurdigitic spew into the sawdust, and shook his head with a sort of lazy scorn. "What year would that be about?" Mr. B interrogated. "Can you recall the boats?" Our swordless sailor munched heavily a while hungrily before answering. "I'm tired of all them rocks in the sea," he said, "and boats and ships. Salt junk all the time." Tired seemingly, he ceased. His questioner, perceiving that he was not likely to get a great deal of change out of such a wily old customer, fell to wool-gathering on the enormous dimensions of the water about the globe. Suffice it to say that, as a casual glance at the map revealed, it covered fully 3/4 of it, and he fully realized accordingly what it meant to rule the waves. On more than one occasion, a dozen at the lowest, near the North Bullet Mount, he had remarked a superannuated old salt, evidently derelict, seated habitually near the not particularly relent seat on the wall, staring quite obliviously at it and at him, dreaming of fresh woods and pastures new as someone somewhere sings. And it left him wondering why. Possibly he had tried to find out the secret for himself, floundering up and down the antipodes and all that sort of thing, and over and under, well, not exactly under, tempting the fates. And the odds were 20-0. There was really no secret about it at all. Nevertheless, without going into the minutiae of the business, the eloquent fact remained that the sea was there in all its glory, and in the natural course of things somebody or other had to sail on it and fly in the face of Providence, though it merely went to show how people usually contrived to load that sort of onus onto the other fellow, like the hell I did in the lottery and insurance, which were run on identically the same lines, so that for that very reason, if no other, Lifeboat Sunday was a highly laudable institution to which the public at large, no matter whether living inland or seaside, as the case might be, having it brought home to them like that, should extend its gratitude also to the harbor masters and coast guard service, who had to man the rigging and push off and out amid the elements whatever the season. When duty called, Ireland expects that every man and so on, and sometimes had a terrible time of it in the winter time, not forgetting the Irish lights, Kish and others, liable to capsize at any moment, rounding which he once with his daughter had experienced some remarkably choppy, not to say stormy, weather. There was a fellow sailed with me in the rover, the old seated, himself a rover, proceeded, went ashore and took up a soft job as gentleman's valet at £6 a month. Then were his trousers up on me, and he gave me an oilskin and a jackknife. I'm game for that job, shaving and brush up. I hate roaming about. There's my son now, Danny, run off to sea, and his mother got him took in a draper's in Cork, where he could be drawing easy money. What age is he? Queried one here who, by the way, seen from the side, bore a distant resemblance to Henry Campbell, the town clerk, away from the cark and cares of office, unwashed of course, and in a seated get-up, and a strong suspicion of no sapient about the nasal appendage. "Why," the sailor answered with a slow puzzled utterance, "my son, Danny. He'd be about 18 now, way I figure it." The submarine father hereupon tore open his gray or unclean anyhow shirt with his two hands and scratched away at his chest, on which was to be seen an image tattooed in blue Chinese ink intended to represent an anchor. "There was lice in that bunk in Bridgewater," he remarked, "sure as nuts. I must get a wash tomorrow or next day. It's them black lads I objects to. I hate those buggers. Suck your blood dry, that does." Seeing they were all looking at his chest, he accommodatingly dragged his shirt more open so that on top of the Timahonor symbol of the mariner's hope and rest they had a full view of the figure 16 and a young man's side of face looking frowningly rather. "Tattoo," the exhibitor explained. "That was done when we were eyeing becalmed off Odessa in the Black Sea under Captain Dalton. Fellow, the name of Antonio, done that. There he is himself, a Greek." "Did it hurt much doing it?" one asked the sailor. That worthy, however, was busily engaged in collecting round the somewhere in his squeezing her. "See here," he said, showing Antonio. "There he is cursing the mate. And there he is now," he added, "the same fellow, pulling the skin with his fingers, some special knack evidently, and he laughing at a yarn." And in point of fact the young man named Antonio's livid face did actually look like forced smiling, and the curious effect excited the unreserved admiration of everybody including Skin the goat, who this time stretched over. "Ah, eh," sighed the sailor, looking down on his manly chest. "He's going to ate by sharks after. Ah, eh." He let go of the skin so that the profile resumed the normal expression of before. "Neat bit of work," one longshoreman said. "And what's the number for?" "Loafer number 2 queried. "Eaten alive?" a third asked the sailor. "Ah, eh," sighed again the latter personage, more cheerily this time with some sort of a half-smile for a brief duration only in the direction of the questioner about the number. "8. Agreed he was." And then he added with rather Glasbert humor considering his alleged then, "as bad as old Antonio, for he'll on my onio." The face of a streetwalker glazed and haggard under a black straw hat peered askew round the door of the shelter, palpably reconnoitering on her own with the object of bringing more grist to her mill. Mr. Bloom, scarcely knowing which way to look, turned away on the moment flusterfied but outwardly calm, and, picking up from the table the pink sheet of the Abbey Street organ which the Jarvey, if such he was, had laid aside, he picked it up and looked at the pink of the paper, though why pink? His reason for so doing was he recognized on the moment round the door the same face he had caught a fleeting glimpse of that afternoon on Ormond Quay, the partially idiotic female, namely, of the lane who knew the lady in the brown costume does be with you, Mrs. B, and begged the chance of his washing. Also why washing, which seemed rather vague than not, your washing. Still candor compelled him to admit he had washed his wife's undergarments when soiled in Hull Street, and women would ended to a man similar garments initialed McBeely and draped as marking ink hers were, that is, if they really loved him, that is to say, love me, love my dirty shirt. Still just then, being on tenterhooks, he desired the female's room more than her company, so it came as a genuine relief when the keeper made her a rude sign to take herself off. Round the side of the Evening Telegraph he just caught a fleeting glimpse of her face round the side of the door with a kind of demented glassy grin showing that she was not exactly all there, viewing with evident amusement the group of gazers round Skipper Murphy's nautical chest, and then there was no more of her. "The gunboat," the keeper said. "It beats me," Mr. Bloom confided to Stephen, "medically I am speaking, how a wretched creature like that from the Lock Hospital reeking with disease can be bar-efficient enough to solicit how any man in his sober senses, if he values his health in the least. Unfortunate creature. Of course I suppose the man is ultimately responsible for her condition. Still, no matter what the cause is from." Stephen had not noticed her and shrugged his shoulders, merely remarking, "In this country people sell much more than she ever had in drawing trade. Fear not them that sell the body but have not power to buy the soul. She is a bad merchant. She buys dear and sells cheap." The older man, though not by any manner of means an old maid or approved, said it was nothing short of a crying scandal that ought to be put a stop to, and stand her to say that women of that stamp, quite apart from any old maidish squeamishness on the subject, a necessary evil, doubly were not licensed and medically inspected by the proper authorities, a thing, he could truthfully state, he, as a paterfamilias, was a stalwart advocate of from the very first start. Whoever embarked on a policy of the sort, he said, and ventilated the matter thoroughly, would confer a lasting boon on everybody concerned. He is a good Catholic, he observed, talking of body and soul, believe in the soul. Or do you mean the intelligence, the brain power as such, as distinct from any outside object, the table, let us say, that cup? I believe in it myself because it has been explained by competent men as the convolutions of the gray matter. Otherwise we would never have such inventions as X-rays, for instance. Do you? Thus cornered, Stephen had to make a superhuman effort of memory to try and concentrate and remember before he could say, "They tell me on the best authority it is a simple substance and therefore incorruptible. It would be immortal, I understand, but for the possibility of its annihilation by its first cause who, from all I can hear, is quite capable of adding them to the number of his other practical jokes, corruptio per sine corruptio per accidens both being excluded by court etiquette." Mr. Bloom thoroughly acquiesced in the general gist of this, though the mystical finesse involved was a bit out of his sublunary depth. Still he felt bound to enter the murder on the head of simple, promptly rejoining, "Simple? I shouldn't think that is the proper word. Of course, I grant you, to concede a point, you do knock across a simple soul once in a blue moon. But what I am anxious to arrive at is it is one thing, for instance, to invent those rays Roentgen did or the telescope like Edison, though I believe it was before his time. Galileo was the man, I mean, and the same applies to the laws, for example, of a far-reaching natural phenomenon such as electricity. But it's the horse of quite another color to say you believe in the existence of a supernatural God. Oh, that, Stephen expostulated, has been proved conclusively by several of the best-known passages in Holy Writ, apart from circumstantial evidence. On this knotty point, however, the views of the pair, poles apart as they were both in schooling and everything else with a marked difference in their respective ages, clash. Has the more experienced of the two objected, sticking to his original point with a smile of unbelief. "I'm not so sure about that. That's a matter for everyman's opinion, and, without dragging in the sectarian side of the business, I beg to differ with you in toto there. My belief is, to tell you the candid truth, that those bits were genuine forgeries, all of them put in by monks most probably, or it's the big question of our national poet over again, who precisely wrote them like Hamlet and Bacon, as, you who know your Shakespeare infinitely better than I, of course I needn't tell you. Can't you drink that coffee, by the way? Let me stir it. And take a piece of that bun. It's like one of our skipper's bricks disguised. Still no one can give what he hasn't got. Try a bit." Cold and cynical, quoth he, Stephen contrived to get out, his metal organs for the moment refusing to dictate further. Fault-finding being a proverbially bad hat, Mr. Bloom thought well to try to the clotted sugar from the bottom, and reflected with something approaching acrimony on the coffee palace and its temperance and lucrative work. To be sure, it was a legitimate object, and beyond ornated a world of good, shelters such as the present one they were in run on teetotal lines for vagrants at night, concerts, dramatic evenings and useful lectures, admittance free by qualified men for the lower orders. On the other hand, he had a distinct and painful recollection they paid his wife, Madame Marion Tweedy, who had been prominently associated with it at one time, a very modest remuneration indeed for her piano playing. The idea, he was strongly inclined to believe, was to do good and net a profit, there being no competition to speak of. Sulfate of copper poison SO4 or something and some dried peas he remembered reading of in a cheap eating house somewhere, but he couldn't remember when it was or where. Anyhow, medical inspection, of all eatables seemed to him more than ever necessary, which possibly accounted for the vogue of Dr. Dibble's 6 cocoa on account of the medical analysis involved. "Have a shot at it now," he ventured to say of the coffee after being stirred. thus prevailed on to at any rate taste it. Stephen lifted the heavy mug from the brown puddle it clopped out of when taken up by the handle and took a sip of the offending beverage. Still it's solid food, his good genius urged. I'm a stickler for solid food, his one and only reason being not gormandizing in the least, but regular meals is the sine qua non for any kind of proper work, mental or manual. You ought to eat more solid food. You would feel a different man. Liquids I can eat, Stephen said. But oh, oblige me by taking away that knife. I can't look at the point of it. It reminds me of Roman history. Mr. Bloom promptly did as suggested and removed the incriminated article, a blunt horn-handled ordinary knife with nothing particularly Roman or antique about it to the lay eye, observing that the point was the least conspicuous point about it. Our mutual friend's stories are like himself, Mr. Bloom apropos of knives remarked to his confidant so devout. Do you think they are genuine? He could spin those yarns for hours on end all night long and lie like old boots. Look at him. Yet still, though his eyes were thick with sleep and sea-air, life was full of a host of things and coincidences of a terrible nature, and it was quite within the bounds of possibility that it was not an entire fabrication, though at first blush there was not much inherent probability in all this. He got off his chest being strictly accurate gospel. He had been meantime taking stock of the individual in front of him and Sherlock Holmesing him up ever since he clapped eyes on him. Though a well-preserved man of no little stamina, if a trifle prone to baldness, there was something spurious in the cut of his jib that suggested a jail delivery, and it required a violent stretch of imagination to associate such a weird-looking specimen with the Oakham treadmill fraternity. He might even have done for his man, supposing it was his own case he told, as people often did about others, namely, that he killed him himself and had served his 4 or 5 good-looking years in durance vile, to say nothing of the Antonio personage, no relation to the dramatic personage of identical name who sprang from the pen of our national poet, who expiated his crimes in the melodramatic manner above described. On the other hand, he might be only bluffing, a pardonable weakness, because meeting unmistakable mugs, Dublin residents, like those Jarvies waiting news from abroad, would tempt any ancient mariner who sailed the ocean seas to draw the long bow about the schooner Hesperus and etc. And when all was said and done, the lies a fellow told about himself couldn't probably hold a proverbial candle to the wholesale whoppers other fellows coined about him. Mind you, I'm not saying that it's all pure, he resumed. Analogous scenes are occasionally, if not often, met with. Giants, though that is rather far cry, you see once in a way, Marcella the midget queen. In those waxworks in Henry Street I myself saw some Aztecs, as they're called, sitting bow-legged. They couldn't straighten their legs if you paid them because the muscles here, you see, he proceeded, indicating on his companion the brief outline of the sinews or whatever you like to call them behind the right knee, were utterly powerless from sitting that way so long, cramped up, being adored as gods. There's an example again of simple souls,